Hey everyone, we're just going to give people a few minutes to join, so just sit tight and we'll get started in a bit. Everyone, thanks for joining. If you just hopped on, we're going to give people a few minutes to join and then we'll get started. All right, we'll give people about one more minute to join and then start. All right, so I'll just give you guys a background before we hand it over to Mark. So for those of you who don't know, this is a presentation hosted by IMU. IMU is a lower limb load monitoring solution for return to play and just general load monitoring. So just a few pieces of housekeeping. Number one, you'll see on the bottom, you have a Q&A section. So if you have any questions for Mark during the presentation, throw them in there, and then at the end we will have a Q&A portion. You also have the ability to look at the chat down there at the bottom, so if there's any helpful links, we may be throwing stuff in there, so just keep an eye on that. At the end of the presentation, we will send you to Mark's case study that he's going to be extrapolating on from this presentation, so I definitely recommend giving that a read. It goes a lot more into depth into the actual data than we'll get into in this presentation. And then you will be sent the recording. So after we process the recording, you'll be sent that tomorrow probably, and you'll also have the ability to log into our example dashboard and take a look at some data and play around with it on your own time. So let me introduce to you Mark Armitage. So Mark is a UKSCA strength conditioning coach. With his primary experience in football. He has worked for Norwich, Southampton, Arsenal, and Huddersfield, I think I said all those right, Town Football Clubs, as well as the English Football Association. He has a degree in sport and exercise science, a master's in strength and conditioning, postgraduate certificate in education, and is a teaching fellow at the Higher Education Academy. Currently, Mark is completing his PhD at the University of Suffolk, where he is the course leader for strength conditioning. He's also the company director for East Coast Conditioning and Rehabilitation. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mark and let him get started.
Thank you, James. Thank you for that kind introduction and having me on this webinar. So hopefully, as highlighted through the logos on screen, I guess I'm extremely privileged really to have worked in some unbelievable environments and with some world-class staff and players. So I spent around 10 years or so working applied in football before moving into academia. And obviously, like you mentioned, embarking on my PhD with the objective really of trying to support in the quantification of field-based rehabilitation for football. Alongside this, I run a rehabilitation company with my wife, and from which this case study was completed. So I just wanted to start with a couple of disclaimers, if you like, and obviously to declare no conflict of interest. IMU have merely been kind enough to let me trial IMU Step, basically to enable me to gain a greater understanding in the external biomechanical loads associated with my current field-based rehabilitation practices. I should also say that I'm not a biomechanist, and I should give early and full credit to one of my supervisors, Stuart McCurlin-Naylor, who has really helped me to understand and contextualise some of the data which we got from this case study. Obviously, I'm not a therapist, and that's why I married my wife. And I once joked with Dan that I'm just the guy who gets wet in the rain. He laughed then, so I thought I'd chuck it in again now. So to crack on with the case study centred on a 21-year-old male semi-professional football player who had previously been a professional, and thus they had quite a high training specific age of around 10 years. This meant that they also had some good athletic development experience of around 6 years. I guess if you wanted to describe the physical profile of this player, you could almost describe them as strong, quick, and quite powerful. As we know though, unfortunately, strength doesn't save all. And in this case, the player had previously experienced a right ACL reconstruction, which resulted in around 16 months of time lost. The current injury was a left ACL rupture, which was sustained during a game via a hyperextensive mechanism in February 2019, which resulted in a surgical reconstruction via a hamstring graft in March 2019, and our first contact with the player wasn't until August 2019. I guess I should say at this point, and obviously we have full permission from the player to share with you his journey to date today, and obviously we give them great thanks for letting us to do so. So with regards to the initial consultation, like I said, this took place 4 months after their surgery. And unfortunately, up to this point, there wasn't any direct intervention or aftercare from a therapist, but the player had self-progressed themselves to running and plyometric activity. However, their knee was still lacking full extension, it was still hot, it was still swollen, and it was discoloured. And I guess you could generally describe it as still in a state of acute healing. So what was our initial plan? And on hindsight, this might not have been the best plan because we decided to regress the player. So it probably wasn't best with regards to trying to build a relationship and trust and buy-in early on. But we thought it was vital that the player regressed from running until their knee, until they could basically achieve full extension, both passively and actively. We obviously wanted to reduce the amount of effusion in the joint. I guess ideally we'd get this down to a trace, but I guess we'd start working around a grade 1. And also it wouldn't be a rehab program if we didn't try to improve their glute function or increase their sort of dynamic ankle range. For me as well, I wanted to work on their hip hinging patterns. And that's because I would typically describe this player as almost like an anterior loader. And by this, I mean that they would go into knee flexion and almost forward translation to initiate movements. And I guess this goes back to my previous point about strength. Now, please don't get me wrong, strength is massively important in the rehab process, as it is also for performance. I guess if you like, I'm one of the old school movement guys, and I think this held quite true in this case study as well. Obviously, there was a difference between limbs post-injury, but like I say, generally the guy was quite strong, and his thighs were already the size of my chest. So I guess what we didn't try to do, we didn't try to necessarily give him anything too new with regards to external load and resistance. But I guess what we wanted to do is we wanted to try to really coach out and harness their clear athletic potential. And quite often, I guess I have a challenge with my own philosophy with regards to how strong would be strong enough. So this is what we did initially. So my wife cracked obviously with the therapy side of things, which meant that I could work with the player in the pool, and we could start to do some exercises with regards to trying to restore some range, as well as improve their movement efficiency, if you like. From here, we went on to an isometric focus. And again, strength is massively important. So we felt if we did isometrics, we could give the player the sufficient stimulus, but that potentially we could do these in slightly safer positions. Then we went on to through range exercises, to exercises which more closely replicated, hopefully, the demands of their sport. Now, obviously, what we didn't do is we didn't go through these phases in isolation. Typically, when we work, we try to follow the 80-20 rule. But I guess what we wanted to do in this case study is obviously to create quite a clear framework and structure, because we knew there was going to be certain constraints which we were going to be faced. And obviously, considering what happened in the rehab up to the point which we first made contact. Obviously, the pictures on screen are screenshots. Just for transparency, if you are interested in watching the videos, then head over to our Instagram page because they're on there. So like I say, we come up with this hopefully quite structured program because we almost wanted to create a little bit of accountability as well. and should give the player full credit. They did everything that we asked and did it extremely well. However, we were still struggling with that extension. So my wife could achieve it after therapy sessions with regards to passive extension, but the player struggled to control it actively, and there wasn't very good crossover between sessions. And I guess if I'm being honest, we felt that we were slightly starting to go around in circles. So what we decided to do is we decided to go back to the consultant for a review, who decided to basically perform a second procedure, and that was to effectively remove a scar tissue blockage. Now, after this second procedure, we're really cooking on gas. So what we're going to do now is we're going to accelerate this case study up until the point that the player was cleared to return to running. Just in the interest of time for today, we're not going to go through it, but obviously alongside this case study, there was hopefully quite a robust return to play criteria or exit criteria. So at this point, we would have felt that there was sufficient symmetry between limbs, there was a certain amount of strength, effusion was managed, and obviously range of motion was restored. So yeah, we could recommence sort of field work, if you like. So here is a schematic of something that I've tended to use quite a lot in the past. And this for me is sort of logical progressions, if you like, with regards to how I try to reintegrate an athlete back into running after injury. Now, this probably isn't anything new, and hopefully for you guys listening, you've probably got your own versions of. But for me, if I'm being self-critical, I guess I tend to always do this, basically because I've always done it. And at the moment, I don't feel confident that I can specifically quantify some of these drills and tasks. So again, if we're being honest, sometimes I'm not sure if I'm regressing or progressing the player. Now, don't get me wrong. What we don't want to do is we don't want to create a reductionist approach, or we don't want to create what I might call manual clinicians. So for example, we don't want people in their rehab just to go from A to B to C to D, because we know that the human body and sports injuries are far too complex for that. I do think though, with regards to my sport in football and looking into the literature, that there's obviously an issue with regards to injury rates and injury reoccurrences, and that basically the financial implications and the implications on performance can be massive. So for me, clinicians should use their skills, their knowledge and their experience to decide when and where to put certain things into the rehab program. But I do believe that we can perhaps yield some greater insights through making this process a little bit more objective. So what I want to do now is I want to zoom in, if you like, into the stepwise progressions which actually happened in this case study. So these sessions were put on basically to increase running-based volume, if you like. And we're going to concentrate on these first four drills or sessions here. So we're going to have a look at some GPS data. So hopefully what you can see here with regards to total distance and the load metrics used by the provider, which I use, we can see that there's a clear linear progression over time. Just to provide some context to this, because obviously that is quite linear and it's quite a steep progression, if you like, it's probably worth reiterating that this is early stage field-based rehab. So at the same time, the player's obviously going to be carrying other work with regards to in the therapy room or in the weights room or in the pool or wherever they might be. So in actual fact, I was only really getting on the grass every probably 4 to 7 days, which means obviously there was ample time in between sessions for rest and recovery and so that adaptations take place. Now, like I say, I'm quite fortunate in that I've repeated these drills quite a few times to this point in my career. And something I should say is that I think that they're relatively stable. And by that, what I mean is if a player repeats a certain drill or different players complete the same drill, there isn't great variance in the data. And I guess that's kind of logical because obviously we can control some of the constraints we put on the task. So I can control the distance and the speed and the time. So now I know that I can build this nice volume base early in my rehab. I guess the next question I want to try to answer is how do different individuals respond within these certain drills? And I guess that's why the trial of IMU Step come about. So what we can see here is from exactly the same points and comparing obviously GPS with IMU Step. Now, just to be ultimately transparent, I do believe that IMU Step still has a little bit of work to do with regards to independently validating some of its metrics. But being honest, in my opinion, I'm pretty sure that's just a matter of time. But again, as a clinician or a practitioner, just looking at the data in front of us, it perhaps challenges me to think basically what I've thought up to this point, how true actually is that, and how can greater insights perhaps shape some of my current thinking. So just to explain some of this data, so what I've done is I've basically, and I've been a bit naughty here and I'll explain it in a second with regards to bone stimulus, because what I've done is I've split the data down so it only includes the time at which the player was running. So basically I've removed all rest periods, whether they be active or passive. So if we take the jog walk 60 seconds on, 60 seconds off times 10, the data displayed only for 10 lots of 60 seconds when they were running. And the reason I've done that is because obviously I wanted to make sure I was presenting consistency within data. The reason I say that I've been a bit naughty or cheeky with regards to bone stimulus, as I found out throughout this trial, you can't really split bone stimulus within a session. And the reason for that is what they call exponentially weighted, which basically means it carries on increasing throughout the session. So if you were to split down your session, the last drill or practice would give the same bone stimulus as the overall session. And I guess the reason for that is obviously tibial accelerations are used as a surrogate of bone stimulus. And obviously what we can't do is we can't go back and remove the accelerations experienced by the tibia earlier on. So I guess if you like, one of the takeaways from me and one of my learnings from this case study is bone stimulus is a metric which can be used to compare between sessions, whereas impact load is a little bit more linear, which means it can be split and we can start to analyze data from within a session. Now, obviously what we can't start to do is we can't start to compare apples with oranges. GPS and IMU Step or any form of accelerometry or any inertial measurement unit are two totally separate technologies. And perhaps what we can do is we could either use the different technologies to answer different questions, or perhaps we can start to use different technologies to yield greater insights into a particular question. So there's still lots of work to be done, but I guess I'm now starting to form an opinion of, is there a difference between external running load and external biomechanical load? And from this case study, I'm starting to believe there is. Now, like I say, there's still a lot more work to be done. And I think what will happen is as we start to explore new technologies, effectively what we'll need to do is try to work out how we can integrate these processes to basically make it more usable for practitioners and clinicians. So what I thought I'd do here is I'll go through some GPS data and highlight, if you like, a couple of bits of my field-based rehab philosophy. So if we start here and we look at total distance. So hopefully you can see here is slightly undulated, as you'd probably expect with normal periodization. But across the first sort of 12 to 13 session, there's a nice gradual increase in total distance. And the reason for this is if I'm working with a rehab case, which is especially if it's mid to long term, what I try to do is I try to build a decent volume base, so to speak, so I can be fairly confident that the tissues have the tolerance to cope with the greater intensities, which I know we're going to follow. So in a practical sense, practitioners could often use something like total distance or distance cover as a marker of volume. And then they could use something like distance per minute or meters per minute as an indicator of intensity. So we can see here in the case study, there is quite a shift with regard to meters per minute. So there's an obvious turn point, if you like. And again, this would have coincided with the objective markers or the exit criteria which were running alongside this case study. So we would have basically started to have more confidence with regards to limb symmetry, limb strength, reduction in effusion, improvement range of motion, etc., etc. So we could be more confident on the grass or on the field that what we could do is we could start to expose the player to movements which were more complex or a greater speed or intensity. As we go through the rest of the rehab process, again, slightly undulated in accordance with periodization, but you can see here that meters per minute is relatively stable. So just to explain that a little bit, because if we go back earlier across the first maybe 7 sessions, we could see meters per minute is a lot higher and it's rising. And again, this will be due to the fact of some of the sessions that we were putting on. So at this time, if you like, the sessions were more continuous, or they were definitely what I would call sort of slower, longer intervals. So effectively, the player could just cover greater distances in an appropriate amount of time. As we transitioned through the rehab, it doesn't mean that intensity was reduced, it means the total opposite. So it means that as intensity was starting to ramp up and there were periods within the session was extremely challenging, obviously there would have had to be periods of rest within the same session. So work to rest ratios start to come into play, which means that the overall outputs, if you like, would have appeared to be diminished. So I guess this reinforces the point I tried to make earlier. For me, when I'm looking at a rehab case, not only do I try to look between sessions, but I think it's massively important that we look within. So this is IMU Step Data across exactly the same period. So this is for every session which we was able to collect data. And I'm going to start off with bone stimulus because I thought this was quite interesting because it quite closely replicates the outputs for distance covered. So this would indicate to me that, if you like, my logical progressions, which I've used for a period of time now, with regards to an external biomechanical load, might not be too far off. And I thought it was quite interesting that across these first few sessions, the impact load remains below bone stimulus, which again probably reinforces my volume first approach initially. Now, something I haven't quite got the answer to just yet is across sessions, well, maybe 10, but definitely 11, 12, and 13. To me, that looks like bone stimulus is almost plateauing, or almost that there's almost like a saturation effect. So this could indicate that perhaps the player was ready from a mechanical point of view to be pushed on in their rehab, and that's exactly what we did in the middle stage. So we can see here intensities are starting to ramp up. Sessions would have become more frequent, so then obviously we would have had to have built more tapers into the sessions which we were delivering. So the last point I want to make on this slide is obviously there's quite noticeable taper here, and this is a little bit of an anomaly. Because basically, as I found out, working with semi-professional athletes, unfortunately, isn't all sort of sunshine and rainbows. There's obviously lots of constraints which are in place. And I guess in an ideal world, something I would ideally love to do with an ACL rehab case is to use like a gymnastics facility earlier on in the rehab program, because I think it's a brilliant environment which we can really do some great work and challenge the athlete. So just to get back to the data here. So what happened was we cracked on with rehab. We couldn't go to a gymnastics centre because of constraints, whether it be financial, time or facilities. So we just carried on with my normal field-based progressions. And in the session before this big taper, the player fell over for the first time. Now, if you're working on the grass with an athlete, you'll know that feeling when they fall, or even if you've got a child, sometimes it feels like it takes an eternity for them to hit the ground. And that was definitely the situation in this case. And I think it was quite apparent that the player was really uncomfortable with falling, basically because they de-skilled in the task. They hadn't done it for 12 months. So what we did is we went and we backfilled and we went to gymnastics centre at this point. Now, I appreciate it's only one session, but I do think it served a purpose with regard to ticking another box and trying to give the player as much confidence as possible. So what's my point with regards to impact loads? I guess that is that a change in surface, so going to a gymnastics centre, massively changed impact loading, which probably isn't that sort of surprising, if you like. But it made me self-reflect, and maybe that I missed a trick. So perhaps what I should have done is I should have used IMU Step earlier in the rehab process, so I could have got more objective data for a longer period. So effectively, any time the foot leaves and recontacts the floor, I guess that we can obviously measure accelerations. So it could be maybe in the pool for plyometric progressions. It could be used in the gym if we're working on plyometrics or running mechanics, etc., etc. So I think obviously like GPS is for sure one of the go-to tools with regards to quantifying external running loads on the field, and I'll use it and I'll continue to use it. But for me, there is a little bit of disparity, if you like, between the objective measures we take indoors and those that we take outdoors. So I guess one of the points I wanted to make on the last slide is I think obviously there are still lots of questions that we want to answer, and I just think that we have to be quite open-minded in the way that we achieve this. And I think in that approach, we have to probably be quite open-minded to investigate technologies which can give us the greatest amount of data across the whole of the rehab period. So here's some more GPS data, and we're going to start with sort of an increase in max speed, if you like. And I think this is fairly well established now in our industry that if an athlete's out for any period of time, that you want to gradually increase their maximum speed exposures, obviously because of the potential, if you like, for soft tissue or muscular injuries. And I think you can see here again, although slightly undulated and according to periodization, generally there's a nice positive trend with regards to increasing their speed. Like I say, this is fairly logical for all injuries, and I think it's massively important for an ACL injury, especially if we consider the sort of protective aspect of the hamstrings on the knee. So this was quite a positive, I think, from this case study, but you can see something lurking behind it, which wasn't so great. And that was this speed bump, if you like, or massive spike in high speed running. So to try and explain that. So high speed running from session to session went from 54 meters to 767 meters, or there was an increase of 713 meters, or 174% difference. Now, don't get me wrong, in an ideal world, if I could turn back time, would I smooth this data? For sure. And why would I do that? I guess I would do that because it would give both myself and the player greater reassurances at the time. And I also think that we need to be mindful of potential litigation issues. And I guess it sort of highlights the potential perilous situation we put ourselves in as rehabbers, and that tightrope that we're walking, because we have to get the players back as quickly as possible and to as high a level as possible. But in doing so, we can't do any harm. So obviously it's very challenging when we're working in these situations to make sure that our loading is appropriate. And for me, I've always tried to work with the individual, and I've been more concerned about the person that's in front of me than potentially data sets which I could present. So I guess I'm not the only person who's ever spiked somebody's loads, and I probably will do it again in the future. And of course, we have to delve into the data because we have to be self-critical, and we have to look at ways to continually improve. But I'm sure I'm not the only person this happened to. And again, technology is great these days. So I can go onto the field, and with me, I can take an iPad or I can take a watch, and that can give me some real time or some live data. Now, I do use it, but I also try to be a coach first. So when I go onto the grass, I try to coach the athletes in front of me. And if you like, try to use some of my clinical skills to try to progress them sort of appropriately. So again, hopefully I'm not the only person who's ever been in this situation. Let's just say it's a nice sunny day like it is here today. You're on the grass working with your athlete and everything's going great. You're coaching well, they're performing well. You come in, everyone's buzzing, it's been a great session. You go to download your data and boom, you've got something like this there in front of you. And again, hopefully I'm not the only person who's had that dreaded feeling when you have to walk back into an MDT meeting, and then there's the clinical lead, whether it be the doctor or the physiotherapist, and you need to try to justify what it is what you've done. So I guess obviously what we do is we try to delve into the data. And again, this isn't necessarily trying to cover our tracks. I think if mistakes have been made, we need to be open-minded to that, and we need to learn from it. But at the same time, I think sometimes we need to scratch below the surface to actually understand what is going on. Because like I say, there's a fine line really between pushing someone too hard and potentially not pushing them hard enough. So like I say, in this case study, what we wanted to try and do is we wanted to try to gradually increase their exposure to maximal speed outputs. And in this particular session, as planned, the player achieved a new max speed to this point in their rehab of 8.6 meters per second. Now, this happened in a specific drill after the warm-up, where the player performed 6 sprints over a set distance with adequate rest in between. So if you're not familiar with some GPS metrics, so high speed running on the system that I use is anything over 5.5 meters per second. Then anything over 7 meters per second would be deemed as very high speed. So in this drill I'm talking about, so the one after the warm-up where we achieved the new max speed, the player, so in the overall session, they got 208 meters of very high speed running. And in this particular drill, they got 204 meters of very high speed running. So most of their speed work was done in the designated part of the session. I guess it's worth throwing out there as well that the player felt that their previous best max speed was somewhere around 10 meters per second. So I guess if we throw that into the mix, you could argue that actually around 559 meters of the 767 meters wasn't necessarily high speed running. Perhaps it was more medium speed running for this player. And obviously that would change the output on the graph. Now, obviously what I'm not trying to do is I'm not trying to justify it. It is what it is. But again, it's just trying to illustrate that sometimes don't sort of take the first snapshot of any data point. One thing I could have done on reflection is I could have used relative rather than absolute speed thresholds. But again, I didn't want to do this because I wasn't sure what the player's max speed actually was. And if I'm being honest, even if I did, I don't know if it would have told me any information regarding the external biomechanical loads experienced. So we have a look now at some IMU Step Data across exactly the same period. So it would take impact load as the metric. So from session to session, so the session before and the session after the spike in high speed running, impact load went from 76,000 arbitrary units to 83,000. Now this was only a change of 7,000 arbitrary units, or a difference of 9%. Now I guess I get that this is a case study and it's only n equals 1, but again it reinforces to me that perhaps this initial spike in load might not have been as potentially problematic as first feared if I sort of didn't embrace new ways of obtaining information. So like I mentioned as well, I'm a big advocate, if you like, of not only comparing between sessions, but also starting to look in sessions. So what I did is I split down the part of this session, if you like, so the bit after the warm-up where they did all of the very high speed running and I've got their new max speed. And impact load, just for that drill, for them 6 runs, if you like, was 7,000 arbitrary units. So if we compare that to the previous session and we look at the splits there, we can now start to see that perhaps the load that the player was exposed to wasn't that dramatic in comparison to what they had previously. Now, just to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, I think this also ties back into what I was trying to talk about on the last slide with regards to going to the gymnastics centre. If we think of speed as a quality, this can be developed in lots of different environments. So obviously some good quality strength work can support it. So too can plyometrics, so too in rehab could be like indoor running mechanic, etc., etc. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is potentially one of the reasons why the player coped with this spike in load was because they were exposed to it earlier on in the rehab process. But what we didn't do is we didn't capture the information. So again, we don't know for sure, but again, I think we need to be open-minded as we try to explore some of these innovations. And I guess on that note, when I was putting this webinar together, James asked me what the difference was with regards to limb symmetry and impact load between these 2 sessions. So i.e., did they load differently in the session where they had a spike in high speed running compared to the one before? So I didn't know, so I looked into it. So if we look at down in the bottom left-hand side as I'm looking at the screen, if we look at step count and bone stimulus, so one thing we are awaiting is we're waiting for confirmation on independent reliability of these devices, because obviously what we need to make sure is any difference is outside the area of the instrument. But I think for the purposes of this talk today, we'd all agree that differences of sort of 2 to 4% would be described as fairly negligible. So no concerns with regards to step count bone stimulus, but impact load is sort of suggesting something. So 3% difference in the session before, 13% difference in this session, obviously a difference of 10. So maybe I did miss a trick. So if we look at the limbs where this work was achieved, most of it has come from the right leg, which was the non-injured leg. So I guess this is very interesting because this would suggest that when we ask the player to go above a certain speed threshold, they're starting to load their non-injured dominant leg once more. Now, obviously, what we don't know at the moment, if this was during the specific drill or whether fatigue accumulated across a session, but it's still quite a useful finding. And it's one I think we dealt with in the rehab or throughout the case study through having a fairly robust structure and obviously picking this up in following sessions and obviously making sure that it was maintaining good quality strength work in the gym. Which leads me on to the whole sort of spike in load concept, if you like. And I guess what we don't know for sure is we don't know if a spike in load is going to directly cause another injury, and we don't know if or when that will occur. And we also know that what we can probably do is to a certain extent, we can manage a player out of a spike in load, i.e. we can adapt the following sessions. So for me, if ever I see a spike, I'm more concerned about the original injury site. So for me, if I see a spike, I'm thinking of that left knee and particularly the ACL. So if we jump back to the left leg and we look at the impact loads, that went from 38.5 to 38.9. So again, it would suggest that the load experience at the injured site potentially wasn't that dramatic. Now, fingers crossed this will work. I can appreciate they were sort of two fairly heavy slides. So what I wanted to do now is I just wanted to chuck in a video really. Because I think one thing we can agree in our industry is context is absolutely key. And there's lots of different ways you can achieve the same outcome. I also appreciate that this is a case study, so I'm obviously picking snippets to illustrate my points. But I guess what I wanted to do through playing this video is to sort of illustrate, if you like, that hopefully these snippets come from a fairly thorough, robust and rigid rehab process. So apologies for the slight blip there. I was just getting some IT support. So my informants tell me that they were a little bit slow and glitchy. So apologies for that. Like I say, the videos are available on our Instagram page. So I'd encourage you obviously to head over to there if you do want to see them. But like I say, I just wanted to put them in to provide a bit of context to the case study. So what I'd like to do now is I'd just like to take your minds back to the GPS data and the turn point, if you like, in meters per minute, and the justification that basically this indicated a change with regards to movement complexity and speeds. And I thought I'd show another schematic which demonstrates my change of direction progressions. Now, obviously what we can't be is we can't be rigid in approach. So when I go to deliver this, I'll either stretch it out or I'll condense it down. A question I get asked quite a lot is this different for different injuries and different individuals? And I guess the answer to that question is kinda. So obviously for every rehab case, I might change how much time I spend on certain components or how long I put in between certain components or whatever the situation is. But at the same time, I do want every rehab case I do, I want to tick every box in my own head. So to a certain extent, every player will go through sort of this process. And I guess the reason for that is obviously what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a stepwise logical progression, or put, if you like, a scaffold around the player to transition them from the treatment room back onto the field. Some people could obviously say with regards to some of these drills or exercises that they're fairly predetermined and they're quite closed skill. and they don't really involve decision making. So they're definitely changing direction over agility, and I definitely get that. So what about the randomness of football? And I guess in my experience, I don't think we can replicate it. I think the only way that we can replicate the random demands of the game is to play the game. And like I say, I see my job as a rehabber is to make sure that the players go through stepwise logical progressions. So I have greater confidence that they can cope with that randomness when they're faced with it. And the beauty of it being random, we don't really know what that's going to be. So something I try to do in my rehab, obviously to smooth that process and facilitate it, is I do try to use, if you like, fit or healthy participants or bodies, particularly towards the end of my field-based progressions. And I think there's two massive windows in this whole process. And the first one comes upon return to training. And I think here, obviously it's massively important that the player is well integrated for effective communication. And then the second one will come with regards to return to play. I have got another video on the next slide, and I will roll with it because it's not as long and hopefully it'll be a bit better. But basically this video will just show these progressions as they were in this case study. Okay, sorry guys, I've just got the message that that's not great, so we will move on, and apologies. And I guess it's a bit of a shameless plug for my business because you're going to have to go there now and watch the videos. So we are nearly there with regards to the presentation. If I can change. If I can change slides. So yeah, we're nearly there. And basically, I just wanted to share with you one more learning experience, if you like, that I gained from trialing IMU Step in this case study. And obviously, this was the first time I'd ever used this technology, and it's the first time I'd ever seen sort of any graphs like this. So this comes from a session quite early on. I think it's in the first 5 sessions. So again, if I'm being honest, I'm looking at this graph and I'm trying to work out what it means. And again, I try to always coach first. So whenever I use new technology, I always try to look at it through the lens of the athlete, because if I can't translate the information to them, it's not really going to add any value. So I'm looking at this graph and thinking, well, what can I tell the athlete about this? And for me, it would indicate that at low impacts, so anything below 6 Gs, they tend to favour their left leg or their injured leg. When we get to medium impacts, so greater than 6 but below 21.5 Gs, they're favouring their right leg, their dominant leg or their non-injured leg. And then when we go into the high Gs of over 21.5, they then switch back to their left leg or their injured leg. And this might be even clearer in this figure. So I guess the way I tried to use information to create communication with the athlete was, for me, if we look at the higher end of the low impacts and definitely into the medium impacts, I think this was probably because of some of the drills we were using at the time. So just a reminder, this was a hyperextension injury. So of course we were doing some running mechanic based work, and we would do some unilateral drills over a set distance. So I think early on in the rehab, when we were doing these drills, basically the player was just afforded more opportunity on their right, their non-injured, their dominant leg, potentially because the differences in strength, in coordination or confidence, all 3 of the above, plus many more. So basically it just enabled conversations with the player to make them aware of this asymmetrical loading, and obviously try to give feedback when they were working, just to gain more confidence in that limb and try to make movements a little bit smoother. As to why it shifted back to the left leg with regards to the higher impacts, for me, I don't think this was necessarily sort of a forced production issue, but potentially more of like a forced absorption issue. And by that, I mean potentially because of differences maybe in strength or coordination or confidence, all three plus many others. I think what they weren't doing was they wasn't controlling their limb into the ground. And instead they were slapping or they were smashing their foot into the floor, which was obviously increasing accelerations at the tibia. So what did we do with this information? Like I say, first and foremost, it's just facilitated some really great conversations with the athlete to make them aware of this asymmetrical loading, and obviously trying to come up with some cues to shift this balance. And obviously it did feed back into their gym-based work to make sure that we're keeping on top of that leg. So did it work? This is an asymmetry tree from the middle part of the rehab process now. And you can see here, obviously, the players are a lot more symmetrical. Again, I'm aware that there'll be some cynics listening and they'll say, well, you're just cherry picking your best data to illustrate your points. And again, just for transparency, this sort of figure is pretty cool because this is a heat map. And basically what this demonstrates is asymmetries across the whole of the rehab process. So as I'm looking at my screen on the left-hand side, you can see towards the upper part of the figure, there's some grays. And this means that obviously we won't get anywhere near high impact loading early on in the rehab process, as you might expect. And then basically the darker the color, the greater the asymmetry. So again, we can see early on that the player is more asymmetrical. As we get into the middle of the rehab process, then colors are lightening up, which suggests that they're less asymmetrical. And now this was pretty cool. As we started to near return to play, I noticed some asymmetries were starting to creep back in. So I tried not to panic. Again, I tried to think logically. And I think the best explanation I can offer is, to a certain extent, human beings are always going to be asymmetrical because we're always going to have our side dominance. And I think as we got towards return to training and the drills become a lot more specific, if you like, the player was just naturally afforded more opportunities to twist, turn, pivot, tackle, shoot, etc., off their right leg, which was their non-injured and their dominant side. So I guess where we have to go from here is we need to get much larger data sets. So then what we can do is we can start to ascertain what potentially is just noise and what could we actually deem as a meaningful asymmetry. And I guess when we do this, it'll be pretty cool if we could differentiate the differences between, if you like, running loads and kicking loads. So that's me done. Obviously, thank you for you guys for listening to me. I guess I should also just sort of disclose quite late on that I guess none of the ideas in this presentation or webinar were truly original because they've all probably been shaped to some extent or another by the people I've been fortunate to work with, past and present. Obviously, my biggest thanks should go to the player for their hard work and their professionalism throughout this case study, and also to the Huddersfield Town Football Club for facilitating it. I'd like to give a special thanks to these appearing on screen now, because I think these have played a key role in either affording me a certain opportunity or experience or really helping me to shape my philosophy. And finally, I'd love to give my thanks to every member of staff and player I've had the privilege of working with to this point. So if we have any questions, James, I'm happy to take them. I'm just going to pop my email up as well in case people would rather contact me directly. And like I say, apologies for the videos, but yeah, they should be available on Instagram if you head over to there. So James, have we got any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Great presentation. Yeah, just a reminder to everyone, if you do have a question to ask, you have that Q&A section on the bottom. So first question, Mark, obviously the metrics are from different platforms. What were your strategies to combine them?
So like I say, I tried not really to compare apples with oranges. So I didn't try to overlay the data at all because I think they give totally different insights. What I tried to do was try to use different sources of information to answer slightly different questions. So I think hopefully the best example of that come from the GPS was indicating a spike in high speed running. Fortunately, the player didn't break down at the time or subsequently. So I was thinking, well, how meaningful is that spike in high speed running? And hopefully the impact load data provided some more insights to be able to answer that. Okay, cool.
Next question is from Anonymous. Is there anything you've changed your mind about during this case study?
I wouldn't say I've changed my mind about. It's obviously been quite challenging, with all due respect, changing environments. So actually I have a lot more respect and admiration potentially for clinicians who perhaps work with amateur or semi-professional athletes because there's so many more constraints in place. And again, I'd like to thank the player in this case study because they had to do quite a lot of the work independently. So things like gym sessions, etc. Obviously, I'd supervise them initially to make sure that they were safe, but then the player would have to complete the work. So I wouldn't say that the only thing I've learned really is to really try to simplify some of my processes and really try to empower the athlete to take responsibility, to try to look after themselves as well.
Cool. So next question, when you were looking at the spike in high-speed running on those previous slides, was there anything that the player subjectively reported with that spike?
No, none at all. And sorry, my story was probably too long-winded. That was one of them days that it just felt like a great session. Like I was happy with the way I coached, the player was happy with the way they performed. And yeah, there was no response. Again, at the level at which this was completed, we don't have the luxury of any monitoring tools with regards to how they respond to the session. But obviously I just check in on WhatsApp, how you feeling? And yeah, there was no sort of change with regards to how the player felt. Obviously there was no reaction to the knees, so there wasn't an increase in effusion, or there wasn't an increase in pain or anything like that. And yeah, the player reported quite well. And to be honest, we fairly much cracked on as normal with regards to what we had planned. If I'm being brutally honest, all I did for the next couple of sessions is I just kept a bit of a lid on some of their speed exposures, just to make sure that obviously I wasn't double spiking them, if of course there was a spike at all.
Okay, next question from Adam. What type of unilateral plyometrics did you implement?
So and again, they're in the video, very simple things. So for me, it was a lot more about movement quality as opposed to trying to make things too complicated. So we'd obviously use props, and I know they're quite sort of contentious with regards to why would you use a ladder. For me, I do use them in this case, especially with hyperextension injury, because I want the player to make contact closer to the hip. So yeah, it'd be a lot of simple stuff like pogo, single leg pogos, different variations. So we're trying to hop, we're trying to hold, we're trying to react, we're trying to react and change direction. So yeah, it was mainly around the quality of the movement. And again, like I say, this player for me was what I'd describe as an anterior loader. So every time they were going into a plyometric activity, it was very quad and knee dominant. So I was really trying to enforce potentially to sit into the hip and to try to shift some of that load onto the posterior chain.
Okay, next question is from Dan. He says that you mentioned that you wish you used IMU Step earlier on in the rehab. What tools, if any, did you use to help structure and progress that earlier stage?
So in the gym, obviously basic volume loads. So trying to keep a track of the loads that the athlete's lifting and the volumes. And again, like I say, it is really hard working sort of at a semi-professional level because you don't have the luxury of all of the technology at your disposal. Before every session, obviously, we'd make sure that there was no reaction in the knee. And I guess, to be fair, that was quite an interesting experience for me because obviously I always remain within my scope of practice. And I am fortunate that my business partner and my wife is a physiotherapist. But again, I'm not in a professional environment anymore where there might be 4 or 5 different physios that you can go to constantly for advice and guidance. So yeah, seeing how the player subjectively reacted was massive for me with regards to, and again, this player had gone through a traumatic injury before. So that was really useful because they really knew their body and they knew what would maybe be a reaction and what wouldn't. So yeah, it taught me to trust the athlete as much as the technology. And like I say, for me, there needs to be an integration of the two. Coach first, but back it up with some decent science.
So this question is from Paulo. He said, did you change anything on your rehab plan based on IMU Step Data? If yes, when and based on what?
Yes, so obviously with regards to some of the asymmetries we were seeing early on, I guess what I would do is, so for example, I think that they were loaded more asymmetrically because sometimes I was constraining the player to a distance. So for example, like I say, they could get more repetitions in on their non-injured legs, so effectively they're loading it more. So I take away some of the constraints in some of the practices, and I'll just get the player to work through maybe a certain number of repetitions, so balanced off. Or I'd even just use my coaching eye and their feel to get them to work to a point where they felt that they were moving with good quality. get a couple of reps in to program it, and then obviously stopping it before they fatigued. I think going forwards, like I say, I'd be very interested to try to catalogue some practices, so then I can start to preempt potentially what some of the IMU step loading is going to be before it happens, and obviously almost use it as a bit of a check and challenge tool.
Okay, great. So the next question is from Catherine. She said, do you use any return to sport questionnaires, IPRRs, for example, alongside the quantitative data? And then also, do the asymmetries correlate to those seen in one RM testing?
Again, yes, we do. I guess this is where it's quite tricky with regards to scope of practice. So I would lead more on some of the performance metrics, if you like. So obviously what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't do like the sweep test of the knee for the level of effusion. I wouldn't check joint range of motion, etc., etc. My wife would look after that. And if you like the testing and monitoring I would do would obviously be the loads they were lifting in the gym, the GPS outputs and the IMU step outputs. But to answer your question, yes, we did use a questionnaire. Apologies, I can ping you an email afterwards with the one that we used. But basically that would suggest that the player was asymptomatic on their what was planned to be their return to training, which obviously we're still awaiting because of the current situation. So yeah, subjective as well as objective. I think there's a lovely saying that we don't work with horses, and I think sometimes we miss that point, and I think that's something I learned working with professional athletes. Some people do really know their bodies, and I guess you have to build the relationships to know who's telling you the truth and who's just trying to manipulate the situation. But in this case study, yeah, the player knew more about their knee than I did, because obviously they were living and they were experiencing it, and they'd had an ACL injury before and I hadn't. So yeah, subjective is massive as well.
Okay, so next question is anonymous, just came in. Did you find performance metrics that a coach would be interested in to help convince athletes, or sorry, let me start over. The word's confused. Did you find performance metrics that a coach would be interested in to help convince coaches to buy into this type of monitoring?
Yeah, I think with regards to IMU Step, the symmetries were quite key, because again, what a coach can do is they can look over and with their coaching eye, I think the player's actually moving quite well, or they're moving quite quick, or whatever the case is. And we could show that actually there was still asymmetries present. So obviously, although they look, and again, it goes back to the differences with regards to perhaps external running loads and external biomechanical loads. But the running loads were okay. Sometimes they would be covering fairly decent, like we hopefully showed, they'd be covering some decent speeds, but there'd still be some asymmetries present. And I guess like all environments, the coaches are very keen to get their players back as quickly as possible. And like I say, in this particular case study, it had a few issues, should we say, early on. So there wasn't more pressure to get the player back, but they'd probably been out for longer up until the point that they needed to be when we sort of took over the case, if you like. So we basically picked it up at 4 months, and really that was a start again point. So yeah, that's what we used, the asymmetries.
Thanks, Mark. I think that's probably all the time we have for questions. So just a reminder, Mark's email is right there at the bottom of the presentation there, and then you will also at the end be directed to Mark's written case study. So I definitely recommend checking that out. So yeah, nothing more. Thank you, Mark, for a great presentation, and thank you for everyone who attended. Keep an eye on your email, and we will send you the recording afterwards. All right,
No
thanks
problems.
everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks for having me and listening. Cheers.